Join us at Denver Community Media every fall for Harvest Your Creativity, a month-long celebration where we offer free, hands-on media workshops and events designed to help you learn new skills, meet other creatives, and just hit record.
Hi, y'all. Welcome. Glad to see a few folks out on a rainy and dreary day. But anyways, I'm excited to kind of jump in tonight as part of this wonderful month-long series of events hosted by Denver Community Media. And I feel very fortunate for what they're all doing here. If you don't know about Denver Community Media, it's a wonderful community-based space here in the heart of downtown Denver that has all sorts of offerings for folks who are looking to get involved and engage with video production, media production, podcast production. There's resources as classes, studio space, podcast space, mentorship, so all sorts of things. So if you haven't been to Denver Community Media, you can come take a tour and just check out there's opportunities to become members, to have a membership and get access to some of the best kind of technology and resources that are available in production. So anyways, I'm excited to be here. My name is Davey Thatcher. I use they, them pronouns. My dear friend and colleague, Anna Ghublikian, isn't able to be here tonight. They are unfortunately out of town and couldn't make it back for this. But fortunately, the better half, Anna Ghublikian, has generously recorded some video snippets that we are going to cover tonight, and I'll share. So tonight we're kind of gathered here together. For the last 10 years, Anna and I have been working on short films, especially in the documentary film space. We've done all sorts of things together, from quilting documentaries to cooking shows and things like that. But our real passion lies in working with nonprofits, community-based organizations, larger campaigns around how do we tell stories in a way that is participant-centered, that creates opportunities for consent, that allows for really changing what has historically been kind of an extractive process in terms of media production and how we tell and use other people's stories. Often is without giving them the space for the power, the consent, accountability, transparency, saying where and how their story will be used. So I'm just going to kind of dive in. Anna and I have a couple of different companies we have sort of worked on together. Emergent Media Collective, which is kind of a collective of queer and POC-based media professionals in Denver, and also Together Creative, which we've done a lot of work around. So I kind of want to just get us started here. I'm going to kick off with Anna giving a little intro, and then I'll jump in after that. But this will just kind of give a little context setting about who we are and kind of what we're doing here tonight. So this is Anna.
Hi, my name is Anna Ghublikian, and I am Davey's coworker, collaborator, co-creator. We've worked on a lot of projects together over the last several years, and are really excited to share some of our perspectives and our processes towards, creating more just and equitable media practices. Sorry I can't be there in person, but really excited to be able to contribute from afar. So thanks for being here.
Great. So I kind of want to just sort of jump in and kind of set the stage and historically, and Anna's going to talk a little bit more about this, but as we look at the history of media and how it's come to be, and as we think about kind of the processes that have been involved, there's a few terms that kind of come to mind that are like deeply intertwined with media production, especially as we think about video production. There's this idea of extraction, and kind of based on our kind of our current systems, right? Like we extract, we produce, we deliver, right? And that process, we're getting better at, I think, as a society, as being like, hey, we want accountability. We want to know how or where our products come from, the things that we consume. And we want to be aware of, is there harm in the production of this process, right? And I think sometimes we don't think about that in terms of media. And so Anna and I have been thinking about the last kind of 10 years as we've tried to struggle and stumble our way through this process of how are these things connected, and how can we bring that sort of awareness of these components into our work, right? And there's this really interesting dynamic where, especially with documentary work, yes, it can be a deep change agent, right? And we can be a catalyst for change, but also the history of documentary work is it's created harm, right? We think about the communities, the stories we were trying to tell, And often they're the ones that have the most risk with the least benefit to the actual documentary production process. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And I'm going to let Anna, who's much more eloquent, and I wish they were here, but we're going to have Anna kind of talk a little bit and give us a 20,000-foot view of more of this historical context.
Some of the context that that really centers our work and that we try to bring in at every stage of our process is considering the legacy of extraction that has come along with traditional media practices, especially journalism and documentary work, and especially when that work involves sharing the stories and experiences of folks with who really live at the margins, either in terms of their identities or their experiences. There's a lot of power in having the resources and the skills to share these kind of stories in an elevated audiovisual way. There's also a tremendous amount of power in being having the autonomy and the agency to decide where we point our camera, where we point our lens. And as Judith Butler says, the frame actually constitutes relevance. So we decide what exists in the frame, and what is in the frame is relevant, and everything that exists outside of it is invisible. It is neither seen nor heard. And that's, of course, a problem because it can perpetuate and recreate some of the power imbalances where those with power continue to determine what gets focus. We, of course, support bringing to light stories and topics that need attention and haven't been given it in the past. But that said, we also have seen a kind of colonization happening around social issues where we extract stories and people's lived experience based on our interest or based on what is sort of current or of the moment. And not only does that feel kind of icky, but it also doesn't fundamentally shift the balance of power when it comes to storytelling.
All right. And so one thing that I learned about kind of early in my film career was, and during these projects that we were working on housing, we were working on health disparities, we were working on things like HIV stigma, was that I often realized, especially owning my own business, that I usually had a lot more to benefit from than the folks I was interviewing, right? These are folks that experience a lot of oppression or deep marginalization or exclusion or don't have access to certain resources. And I would often find myself coming in and creating their stories and telling their stories and realizing, oh, I was getting paid a pretty high day rate to do this, to go into post-production, to tell their stories. And at the end, I had a product where I got to put it on the website and almost like promote my own brand in a strange way. And so there was a deep benefit for me, but also understanding that yes, they're in the campaigns that we were doing, the content and the storytelling that we were doing had the possibility and the potential to bring change to these communities, right? But it wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't always immediate. And especially the work that we were doing and the storytelling we've been doing is kind of systems change work, and that can take a long time. And so what we were asking folks to do is say, we want you to share your story. We want you to let us come into your homes. We want you to film your families and share these stories and these deep, intimate experiences. And those experiences are often tied to experiences of trauma. Because if you live in our society and you have a marginalized identity or intersecting identities, you are bound to experience trauma at these different intersection points. And when we ask people to share that story, there can be real risk of that. If you are a queer person of color who's trans and you're sharing your story, there is a high risk there for you in sharing that story and getting out there. And so I think often in terms of production, our timelines, our goals are don't create the space, the resources, the time, the consent, the transparency, the accountability to the folks that we're working with to make it safe, to make sure that if they're being activated and there's a trauma component there, that we have the resources to support those folks. And is there an actual concrete benefit? And I think that if we can change the paradigm of how we approach media production and switch it from this thing of tight timelines, getting the story, deliverables, to one that is more collective and collaborative process, we can actually shift the benefit for those that we are working with. Recently, I was on the old Instagram, doing my millennial scrolling because I'm not on TikTok, and one of my kind of mentors, Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams, reposted this thing from Natalie Bullock, and it's thinking about how we're talking about folks that experience kind of oppression or what we've called underserved or marginalized. I just kind of want to read this because I think if we can think about folks that we are working with in the documentary space and this lens, we can start beginning to shift how we're going to write interview guides, interview questions, how we're going to plan shooting locations and things like that. So I'm just going to read this really quick. I tried a new phrase in a meeting today. Instead of underserved, underprivileged, historically marginalized, try strategically undervalued. I like it because it emphasizes the purposefulness of racism rather than historically, which gives a kind of happenstance energy and uplifts the community by emphasizing the value of the community rather than emphasizing the marginalization. And Rev said, say it with me, strategically undervalued. And I hope that this lens and how we're kind of thinking about the folks that we are working with is part of a larger process where we are not talking about, we're moving from charity to change to like addressing actual power in storytelling and power differences, right? Because these systems and being strategically undervalued in our society means that when we show up to film a community, an individual, we are showing up with all the systems behind us. We are operating in a larger context, right? And that impacts the production process. It impacts our ability to create safety, well-being on set, and what in the end it actually creates the I don't want to even say product, but the story that we are co-creating with these folks, right? And so I kind of wanted to shift that to think, instead of saying often, and I've used this a lot, is like, we're working with marginalized communities, we're telling stories of historically, underserved individuals. But I want to kind of shift that so we can start thinking about power and co-creation. And so one thing that I've kind of worked on and struggled with in my own personal journey, my journey with video production and storytelling, is just understanding how I'm showing up on set, right? What we bring to set, the video set, the production set, the podcast studio, right? It can matter, right? And I think about understanding kind of where I sit socially, economically, racially, kind of especially in the US context, right? And there's something that's been helpful for me as I've kind of navigated all this, is this wheel of power and privilege. It actually comes from the Canadian government, an agency there that kind of created, as they thought about working with different folks, like, how close are you to the center of power? How far away are you to being marginalized, or in this context, strategically undervalued, right? We have all these different identities, from skin color to our education status to our physical abilities, sexuality, all these things. And as you move in, you can see towards the center of the power, you're seeing dominant identities that allow you much more privilege, much more comfort, much more safety, right? And as you move outward, you become marginal. There's more marginalization. There's less access to power, to safety, and things like that. And so when I show up on a set, I often, I'm a white, able-bodied individual who often presents as a straight man. And that's like cream of the crop, right? There's so much that I get, right? But when I'm showing up with folks who are strategically undervalued and I'm trying to tell their story, I can often represent systems, policies, experiences that have caused harm to these individuals, right? And that will, from step one, will automatically influence the process, right? And so just kind of being aware of the power that we hold as filmmakers, as storytellers at the very start, can really impact those that we are working with. It can impact our ability to create trust. It can impact our ability to make sure that as we're moving through the process, everyone is safe, all these different factors. And it's like a real production thing, but I don't think we ever have a chance to talk about it. And also one thing I would say is that current media and storytelling production is, the timelines are tight. It's so like resource heavy. You got one day to get like 10 shots, and so there's not a lot of space and time to really think about this. So Anna and I have really been thinking about, how do we change the production process, intentionally create more spaciousness, hold space for, some of these identities, how we're showing up, and how do we really change and invest in the trust building and the relational piece of this. Nothing about us without us. This is a quote that came out of the disability rights movement in the early 1990s, specifically in South Africa, and it was kind of adopted and carried forward, especially in the United States, in the disability rights movement. And I think it really encapsulates the story, or like the idea that if we're going to create and tell stories of folks, this maybe should be a guiding principle, right? Like, if we're going to tell someone's stories that's not ours, if we don't have those individuals' input and consent, then we need to stop and pause, right? This picture is from a shoot I did for the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, which Alexis knows about. But Dawn is a disability rights activist working in Denver. And this was a documentary about housing and affordability and the connection between housing, health, and well-being, right? And I remember at the very start, when we were in development and pre-production for this documentary, I met with Dawn, and Dawn was like, listen, if I'm going to work with you, I want you to know nothing about us without us, right? At the outset, I need to be able to have consent, the ability to review things, provide input, and work with you on this. And then another thing that Dawn said to me was like, if you're going to produce a video for folks with disabilities, and I'm advocating for them, we need to create accessibility in the final product, right? And so Dawn at the very beginning asked me to commit to a different way of interacting with her, and also to follow that commitment all the way through pre-production to production to post-production to distribution, right? And so that was just like it challenged me. There are some things I had to figure out technologically in terms of like contrast of fonts and the subtitles, making sure that we had certain different ways for people to review cuts that were accessible to them. And that took some work, but we did it, and we actually created a really strong story because of that. So Anna and I have been kind of thinking through how do we create this new approach, and it can be hard because clients, budgets, all the things. It's challenging. I'm going to let Anna, thankfully, take over for a bit and talk about kind of what we've been thinking and what we've been sort of learning.
As I mentioned before, our aim isn't solely to tell stories that are untold. We do want to do that, but our other, arguably more important goal is to challenge the process where we can and strive to grow towards a more just and equitable process of media creation. Our objective isn't to relinquish our power as filmmakers, but rather to be really clear about what that power is, who it's going to serve, and to use it responsibly by making room to share this power with the other folks who are part of the project, from the subjects or storytellers to the folks farther down the line on the production team. There's one aspect of our work that is very detail oriented in terms of constantly bringing this lens of does this feel extractive? Does this feel transactional? And if it does, we try to interrupt that or rewrite something or rework a process to disrupt that extraction and to disrupt that transaction and make it feel more relational. But I think, the bigger part of it, it's less about creating this ideal process that safeguards against any power imbalance, any extraction, but rather to cultivate relationships and spaces and ways of interacting where individuals can really feel their agency and feel their own power, and create these sites for conversation where we can come to agreement and consensus around the shared goal of elevating a particular story or topic or issue.
Yeah, and so I kind of really love how Anna describes that, right? And that there are some things we've learned that we can be pretty active and concrete, but then there's also this in the production process to make it more transparent, accountable, participant-centered in terms of co-creation and sharing power. But then there's also this other piece that's deeply relational, right? It really is about developing relationships of trust, accountability, and a kind of a consistent sort of check-in, right? And it's this deep relational thing, and it takes more time. But I also think that this process of sharing power, of checking in, of creating multiple ways of consent and input for folks actually creates better stories. And I find that time and time again that as we spend more time there, we spend less time in other areas, right? People feel more comfortable on set. The interviews are better. People are more at ease, more welcome, interested in opening up their lives, and we're able to co-create stories and capture certain footage or elements that we wouldn't have captured otherwise without that trust and that deep relational thing, and the ability for them to be like, oh, hey, I don't feel comfortable right now. Can we stop filming, right? There is an organization called Voice of Witness. They're an oral storytelling project around kind of history and BIPOC history. But they are a great organization. I recommend checking them out. They have these 7 principles of ethical storytelling that have kind of, I think, encapsulate, if we're going to start thinking about the actual production and processes and relational piece of production, here's some really great starting point, right? And I think they provide a little more concrete kind of tools and tactics that we can use. So I'm going to start read through them. Number 1, invest in relationships to build trust, mutual respect, and collaboration. 2, prioritize ongoing informed consent and transparency throughout the process. Ensure narrators have ownership and control over their stories, which I don't think is always the case. 3, honor authenticity, complexity, and the whole person rather than approaching with preconceived expectations or framing narratives as victims or heroes, right? There's something to when we are able to hold space for an entire person and the complexity of that. I think sometimes we try to take interviews and fit them into, like, there's usually a specific theme we're trying to get, or a specific message, and or a specific call to action we're trying to support. And sometimes it can reduce, someone's humanity or how they kind of show up in these multitudes. Use a trauma-informed approach. Number 4. We probably won't have time to get to that today, but that is like really important. And I think as we start to center folks, give them consent, transparency, they know the direction and the timeline and the roadmap for where their stories will be seen and heard, and we kind of bring in some practices around that, we start to kind of get to a trauma-informed approach. 5, position narrators as the experts. I think that is so critical. In our production process, Anna and I often, before we even get to the interview, we spend a lot of time investing in listening sessions. Then from those listening sessions, they could be 1, 2 sessions. Sometimes they require an interpreter or translator. We then create interview guides, and these interview guides are then sent to the folks that we are working with and like, hey, what do you think about this? What do we need to change? What parts of your story are we not telling here, right? And because we know that they are the experts and that folks are really interested in telling their own stories. And we do it all the time. And so we kind of, that part of positioning them as the experts is just so key to this work. 6, acknowledge and mitigate power dynamics and biases. And I think this is a long game for ourselves. It's hard work. Understanding where your conscious and unconscious biases lie and how they actually show up in storytelling is a process, and it takes a lot. And it takes a personal commitment too. If you really want to do this work, like that is a lot of personal reflection, is kind of working through things like the privilege and power wheel, and understanding how these other dynamics might show up. Let's see, ensure stories are accessible to narrator communities. And I think that's just a big thing. That's what Dawn taught me, right? Like, we're going to tell your story, we're going to create it, but like, is it going to be accessible throughout the production process and as we get to distribution and screening? And is there going to be a way for the communities to access this content? I think sometimes we create content and it'll get out there and distributed, but we might not have the resources. We might not have planned, like, how are the communities that have told these stories and shared their stories going to access this? Can they access it first? Is there a community celebration, a free screening? Is it behind a paywall? If so, is there a way to create this content so it's free and accessible to the people who've done the emotional labor and took on the risk of telling their stories? There's another thing called the Dignified Storytelling Handbook. It's a whole handbook. It's an organization, a nonprofit that was created to really get people who are doing digital storytelling, especially in social services, nonprofit, international NGOs, to commit to a series of kind of 10 principles in all of their marketing and communications. And there's things in here that I really like, and there's some that I just hold a little bit more space for. Number 1, it's not my story. I think that's so key, right? Like, yes, you're involved in this, but this is not your story. You don't have ownership over this story. 2, I do no harm. I think that is an aspirational goal, but I also think it's really important to recognize that we are going to do harm. We're human. We have unconscious biases. And when we do harm, we've kind of worked on and invested on, if I misstep here and I hurt somebody or harm somebody in this process, is there a process to be like, to own it, to be accountable, be transparent and kind of repair that. And it can be hard in the production process, but there are things you can do to do that. And it helps you move the process forward. 3, we are all multidimensional, which we've talked about. 4, consent is more than paperwork. I love this because we rely so much on the media release that is complicated, that is legalese, that might not be in the person's native language. And we think that once we get that signature, we are done, we are good. And, you know, in our current systems, yes, you get a consent, you get someone to sign it, you know, you have sort of power to tell that person's story. It almost like it, and we actually ask for ownership of it, right? We ask for ownership of your identity, your story, your kind of visual representation. But if we can shift to be like, consent is a process. Yes, we have to legally, you know, use a release form, but but that's not how we're gonna operate in terms of this whole process, right? We're gonna create really accessible, clear, and key moments for you to provide consent throughout this process, and we're gonna honor those. And we're gonna create it in ways that are accessible. If you have a visual impairment, if language is an issue, we're gonna create moments for you to provide consent. I am biased, repeat, I am biased. I do my homework, I think is really important. The research, really understanding, you know, the history behind, you know, what a community is experiencing and individuals experiencing, the intersections of certain systems of oppression. I am empathetic. 8, I protect others' data like it's my own. This is, I think, is a really important thing. You know, I was filming a documentary, and we turned out that this was someone who kind of had some sensitive identities. Their family found out that they were telling the story, that there were some visuals that we had used, some photographs that went out, and we were like days away from like doing a screening, and we were like, we got to change this. And like, and data is not just like names, numbers, phone numbers, but it's also the different things that can identify folks and things like that. And so we went back, took out all the different photos that this family was like, you cannot use our image associated with, you know, your queer identity, your queer story. We will not allow that, right? And so we had to change the story in the edit. But in the end, like, we prioritize this person's safety. We prioritize their visual identity, the representation of their family, and, you know, and in the end, that was the right choice for everybody. Truth over headlines, like, that's the tension between, you know, what we think we want to deliver for a campaign, for a client, things like that, over what we actually experience in the interview process, in the share, in the co-creation of the story. 10, the story can change the world. Yes and no. It's complicated, but that is the hope, and one of the reasons why we do this work, I guess. Yeah.
I like the concept of that you and Anna mentioned, the instruction process. And in a way, when you start entering post-production, inevitably you are dealing with extraction because you are putting together pieces of that story that you film in production. How do you balance that sense of like ethical storytelling while you're trying to, you know, pick the sections of a video that are fitting to tell the story?
Yeah, great question. I wonder if I should repeat that in the mic. So the question, all right, Ivana, let's see if I can get this right. The question is maybe that there's a tension that when we move to post-production, when we're editing, we've captured all our footage, we filmed it, that tends to be a more extractive process because the editor is usually making decisions on what we see and what we don't see based on what we've captured. And is there ways to kind of mitigate that? And I think that's a great question. Did I get that? Okay. Yeah, and it's a great, and I think part of that is really getting clear, building the relationships of trust up first, and being like, this is what we're doing. These are the clear goals. You're gonna know where your story's gonna go. We're gonna work with you. We're gonna spend time just getting to know you. You get to know us. And then it's like, I think pre-production, there's a connection between pre-production and we're like, where do you feel safe and connected to the footage that we are going to capture, right? And let's spend more time kind of figuring out locations, what we're going to capture and film, and making sure that you feel comfortable with all that, right? And sometimes I've done this where we capture it, and then I'll send like a B-roll compilation to folks and be like, hey, do you feel okay with what we've captured here? Is there anything that you don't feel captured that we've captured in all the B-roll that doesn't feel good to you? And we'll get input there. If we don't have time for that in the production process, it's going through a rough cut, right? And then getting eyes on that before we kind of move into anything else. That rough cut, yes, is going to the producer. If there's a director involved, we have all that. If the DP needs eyes on it, but it's also getting that to that individual and being like, this is how we're starting to think about your story. What feels good? What doesn't feel good? Can you provide us, feedback? And then, and I think it's just providing multiple points as you have your review points and like you're sending it out, like we need revisions and input. Every editor's like, oh my God, I got to send this out to a million people and like deal with all their different creative ideas. But it's also, we're talking about like, does it feel, and we're asking maybe different questions, right? To the folk who share their story and we've captured their B-roll, right? Like how have we cut your interview and what you're saying in a way, does that align? Where did we go wrong somewhere? Is there anywhere that something that you said in this cut might feel like it would pose a risk to you? And if so, like, let us know. And then also like, what are we missing here? What should we change? And so it's just giving them that chance up front. And also one thing that we do too, like in documentaries where we're working with multiple subjects of a certain community or multiple communities, it's like we do these listening sessions where we really spend time being like, what are the key messages that you all feel need to be conveyed? What are the stereotypes that you're experiencing as a community that we need to be both aware of as ourselves, but also maybe break down, right? And we kind of basically a community agreement around the key messages, learning points, stereotypes, and things like that. So sometimes we'll put that up front, and that will help guide interview questions and also help guide the edit, right? But you won't always get it right. And so, but the ongoing conversation is just being like, hey, I think a lot of times maybe people who participate in films or documentary films maybe don't feel like, or there is an explicit thing like, hey, you can be in conversation with us throughout this process, right? It's like, hey, thank you. We got all your footage. We'll send you a link maybe down the road. But I think if we are explicit at the front, being like, hey, you can communicate with us. We're going to continue to communicate through this process if you have time, bandwidth, and capacity, and we want your input. So, and that kind of brings me to the next thing. There is something that I have used. It's called the community engagement spectrum, and CDPHE, Department of Public Health and Environment, created this kind of spectrum or this matrix to kind of help folks who are working with communities, strategically undervalued communities, to understand how do you want and envision them to be involved in your process, right? And I think we can apply this to media production. And so there's these different kind of tiers, right? And in our current system, like there's this, I might not be able to, there might be times that we are in a participation tier, an engagement tier, a partnership tier. And if you look at the participation tier here, it kind of, what is like the outreach, what's broken down into outreach and, hang on, let me step back here. So participation is a certain level, it's the beginning level, and it has a little bit less involvement. Folks, community members have less say and input. So like if you look at this column, outreach, communication flows from the program or initiative to inform community members. Outcome, optimally establishes communication, outreach channels while sharing information with the community. So it's like your basic level of community involvement, right? What does the consultation look like? How involved are they? Community members provide one-time or periodic feedback. Outcome, develops connection. So this is like your base level that I would suggest would be a good starting point if you're kind of new to like thinking about participant-centered or collaborative approaches, right? Like this is a good thing to strive for. If you can move forward, the next level is kind of engagement. What this involves is communication flows both ways and community members provide ongoing participation. Outcome, establishes visibility of the partner and increased cooperation. Collaboration looks like community members influence decision-making, which can be really hard in production. There's not always space for it based on your client, your budget, who's involved, the culture of the production team. Outcome, increased trust and partnership building. And I would say that Anna and I have been in this sort of middle range for a lot of our work, right? Because it's usually client-based, budget. There's usually specific deliverables that we have to deliver for a client, but we try to stay within this. And then there's this partnership, the shared leadership. Community members share power and responsibility, making decisions together. Outcome, a strong partnership with bidirectional trust that affects broader community health outcomes. And that is a different type of storytelling. And ideally, we try to move to that area, to that section, but we don't always get a chance to do that. So I just feel like having kind of a framework of like, yeah, there are options, and it can look, and maybe you're straddling participation and engagement, or engagement with a little bit of partnership. But it's helpful to start thinking about that and how we kind of structure our storytelling. Lessons learned. So here are just some things that kind of Anna and I have kind of thought through that kind of can help at different stages of the production process. One, starting with budgeting. I think budgeting is like the painful, crucial foundation of every media storytelling project, right? And budgets can range widely, as we all know, especially if you are a freelancer or like on the hustle bus. You might have a contract that's thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars, or they're like, we have $2,000, and you're like, okay, great, let me see what we can do. And that can actually impact the process and how we can engage people, right? And so it's challenging. But a couple of things just think about that Anna and I kind of think about is your budget accommodating for items like interpretation, honorariums, which would be, if a community shows up and they're giving their time and their energy and taking some risk, is there budget to do a small honorarium to honor their time and their process of doing that, right? Are we providing food at community listening sessions or at, different parts of that? Budgeting, do we have budget to, like if we're having to book a location, does it feel safe? Is it culturally responsive? Things like that. So there's a couple things on budgeting. When we go into development, like this is where I think using the community engagement spectrum model is like when you're thinking about development and the stories you're going to tell of some of these communities and specific participants, how involved are they going to be in the production process? That might involve timelines, it might involve review process, it might involve kind of different things like that. Development is also, have you conducted community listening sessions to establish trust, build rapport, and really understand what it is a community's priorities, their concerns, any risks that might be associated with filming, with media production, with storytelling. And also too, like, have you done reflection on the power, like the privilege and power of kind of your crew and how could it impact the shoot, right? If you're doing a piece on gender-based violence, gender is obviously going to be a big issue. And who is your producer? Who's doing the interviews? Do you need to swap some folks out? Do people feel safe on set? Moving to pre-production, have you spent the necessary time having clear discussions with filming participants and their community around the goals of the project, how audio or visuals will be used, timelines, what distribution will look like, and where and when participants will be able to provide feedback, consent, and opportunities to revoke consent. If it's and then two, are your film releases accessible? Have you spent time going over that? Going into production, have you created filming schedules that accommodate the various needs and preferences of your participants? Have you hired the necessary interpreters needed for participants? Do participants have been offered or have the necessary supports they need during filming? There's been a few shoots where we were working with native Spanish speakers, and they're like, yes, there's an interpreter there, but they didn't know the interpreter. And they're like, can I have my friend there? And I was like, yes, 100%, and it might not be a friend, or it could be a friend or family member, but maybe it's something else. Maybe there's an animal, which can provide different challenges on set, but making sure people feel safe if they're telling their story, and especially if they're telling a story that is vulnerable or maybe tied to experience of trauma. And also too, I think sometimes is crew from, sound to, if you have, depending on your budget, all the different roles, like, is everyone on the same page about what happens if someone gets activated during a filming, or if someone asks to stop filming? Like, where's everyone going to go? Where are they going to be? Like, how do we create safe spaces when something happens on set that is challenging? And then moving into post-production, have you established a clear review process that is accessible, allows for participant input? Are you protecting the safety of any participants as it relates to their personal information? I kind of shared a little bit more about that previously. And then distribution, community celebration, and this is, we've already talked about this, but like, how will people see their stories? And are you prioritizing and facilitating that access to folks? And I often find too that is there a community celebration? And I find that also measuring impact. When we do these processes collaboratively, there's something that happens within the community. They kind of coalesce around, be able to coalesce around stories and shared visions of kind of how they want to move their story forward, and the power to be able to co-create that. Usually that having a moment of celebration is a huge thing for communities that kind of get together and share. Let me just check. 6 minutes. Maybe I'll just open it up to if anyone has questions, experiences they want to share here. If not, don't worry, but I might share my mic. But I just want to open it up to folks here. Yeah, great question. So the question is, for Anna and I's kind of this sort of approach, are we applying cinema verite, kind of a filming approach where we're a fly on the wall, we're trying not to influence what is happening here? I think we try to do that within a larger context of understanding that whenever you bring a camera into a room, you're automatically shifting someone's experience, right? And you're automatically, whether you like it or not, how small your camera is, how far away you are, there is something, there's an exchange between the camera and someone's kind of lived experience and shows like that. So I think we try to prioritize, yes, what is representative of your story and your day-to-day? How can we film it in a safe way? What do you feel comfortable with us sharing and not sharing? And then we try to say, like, I'll be here, just check in if you get activated or something feels not off, you can interrupt the process. But we will be there capturing what we can, knowing that we are influencing your life, we're disrupting it, but we're trying to capture and convey your story in a way that feels safe to you, the way that gives you agency. So I would say it's not really like cinema verite to that extreme. And I'd also say that cinema verite, like, I mean, kind of the folks who can buy cameras, the folks who, I mean, it's a lot of white dudes three white dudes that have been behind cameras saying that this is cinema verite and we're going to dictate this, and this is a pure form of documentary. And if we don't do this, we're not accurately like telling a story. And I just want to be like, that's insane. But that's just not true, because like if you're showing up with a camera, with a crew, with lights, you have power, you have privilege, you get to tell this person's story. And like, what do you know that allows you to be the true authenticator of this person's story? And so, so I think our approach is different, knowing that we still want to capture people's day-to-day life. That experience matters, and how they move through their life is parts of their story. And we want to make sure that they feel safe, and we capture that in that way. Yeah, great question, Lisa. I'm going to try to summarize it. So the question was around, in the podcast space, which can be pretty commercialized, is there a way, and it's deeply rooted in kind of the interview process and cutting that interview in a way that meets a commercial output or a storytelling output? How do you infuse more of this story-centered storytelling methods, or create a little bit more empathy or space? Those are all really great questions. I think that coming down to if you can prioritize, hey, you're coming in, we're going to interview you. And I think this is true for if you're interviewing like Elon Musk, you're like, I'm not going to tell you anything, and I'm just going to go for it, all right? But if you're working with folks who are, who might be sharing sensitive things, or like, things that, where trauma has happened, or like difficult, I think being really clear, like, hey, let me just have some space and time and slow down at the beginning. Just be like, hey, be really clear on, this is how your story is going to be used. This is the point of this story. So they're really clear on like, oh, and then being really clear on the process, right? And so they can understand like what's going to happen. We'll be in the studio. We're going to ask you these questions, and then we're going to move through this. And then this is the editing process, right? And so they're really clear on how you create and tell their story. I think sometimes people don't really understand like how are you going to create this story? We're going to sit down for like 2 hours and you're going to come out with a 10-minute, story. How does it work? I think being clear on that. Also, I think if you can, the co-creation of an interview guide and topics is really helpful, right? Create something, send it to them, and be like, I want to honor you're the expert on this. I have the technical skills and some of the creative skills to help us kind of tell your story. I want to check in and make sure on this interview guide, what feels comfortable, what doesn't feel comfortable, what did we miss, things like that. And so you're getting real clear if they have consent early on. And then if you can build in consent in the post-production process, like, hey, here's our rough cut. How are you feeling about this? I think that's important too. One other thing I would just say is that, and this comes to more like a sort of trauma-informed approach, is just like in the interview process, being pretty aware and holding space for somatically what is coming up in an interview process. If you notice somebody starting to rub their hands, or they're sweating, or they're having a hard time getting through a question, right? Or they keep stumbling again and again and again, could be just nerves and anxiety, because they'll all experience that, but it also could be an indication that there's an activation, right? And if it is a traumatic activation, what's happening is that, what's going on, their kind of frontal lobes is kind of going back, and it's harder to, be focused, to be coherent, because you're kind of reverting back to a state of trauma. And so if we can create spaces in the interview process where maybe multiple people are kind of holding space for that and be like, oh, there might be some sort of activation going on. Can we take a pause? Can we take a break? Can we get folks kind of what they need? If they ask for a friend to be there, does that friend come in? Just sort of being, I think, holding space for that. And that takes a lot of work. But I think just kind of being really sensitive to that. Yeah. Megan, did you have a question? What's that?
You just answered it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. And I think we'll kind of just skip. I was going to share this. This is Colin. We did this video for Fast Track Cities 5280 project, which is a project to basically reduce stigma around HIV transmission and HIV status. Stigma around HIV status, and so and kind of help people who are newly diagnosed know that, like, hey, you've come a long way since the 1980s, right? And that you can live a full and healthy life. There are, drugs and treatment plans that can allow you to, be sexually healthy and active without transmitting the virus, right? And that there are resources and support, because the stigma is still so deeply heavy. And this was actually the individual I was talking about where we had to take out the family photos, right? And so Colin, is a gay Black man, and just like so fierce and so brilliant. And, we had to navigate and spend a lot of time. It was part of a larger community-based project where we were, before we started this project and before we identified subjects, we were meeting with community, right? And we were kind of discussing, like, what do we need to address in this project? What does this project really need to deliver? What are the key messages? What are the stereotypes? And a lot that came up was, like, there's different aspects. Folks who are monolingual Spanish speakers had a different set of barriers to accessing resources and treatments. And so we had to create some stories that responded to some different identities within the same group that had very different needs, right? And Colin comes from a very conservative religious background from the South, or from Texas. And, and I think his story was pretty sensitive, and it carried some real social risks for him. And so it was like kind of navigating the space. And so we spent a lot of time up front, like really getting to know Colin, getting to know his story, figuring out, what he felt comfortable and safe with telling that story, figuring out the right places to film, and making sure that felt safe. What point we had, he has this wonderful partnership, and the question was, at the beginning of the process, his partner didn't feel comfortable, sharing their story or being part of it. And so, so we honored that, right? But part of his story was really rich, because he's like, you can have a full life, you can have a partner, you can do all these things. But then we're like, oh, your partner doesn't want to be involved. And then we're like, oh, okay, well, we'll shift the story. But we spent enough time with them in their home and getting to know their his partner that eventually we were able to kind of include that in there. And so that was like really special. And there's a big community celebration. We did a screening on World AIDS Day, where everyone that had participated, we did 3 different stories, and everyone was there with their kids, and it was just like so magical. And the story was so rich, and it honored folks and where they needed to be in terms of safety, in terms of the relationships, and then we really made sure like the visuals and the interview process, they had a chance to review it and provide input, and just created this kind of magical space. And it was very, very authentic. And I think this wonderful thing that we learned in measuring impact was that, when some of these videos went out and got started getting shared, doctors started sharing them, and it had this like really interesting effect where more folks were willing to come in to receive treatment, to get support, and which felt like really good, like a huge win, right? And sometimes we don't always get to see the connection between our storytelling and like community impact. And so, yeah. So that about wraps it up. I survived. Sorry, let me just, and then
Hi, my name is Colin Lee.
If there's any questions, Anna and I are always willing to chat about anything. You can email us, Dave.Thatcher at Together Creative Media, Anna at togethercreativemedia.media. And also, we have some other stuff around, we won't get it, I knew we weren't going to get to this, but just in case, some trauma basics, right? And just going over. So if anyone's ever interested in like, oh, we hear trauma-informed approach, but sometimes we don't really have access to what that means or what that could look like in terms of production. But there's a few principles that you can start applying in that process. So anyways, thank you all for coming out on a rainy, snowy, whatever it's happening outside day. Thanks to everyone online. And yeah, and again, feel free to reach out. Anna and I always love talking about this stuff. So thank you.